Evolutionary.org podcast coming your way, episode 515. Steve and the Mobster joining me. How's it going, man?
This is a fun one because it's super interesting for me, and it's one of those future technologies, Steve. So let's hit it.
So we're going to be talking about Ace-031. We're talking about the doses, cycles, benefits, side effects, all that good stuff. So this is going to be a really interesting one. So it's also known as ACVR2B, soluble form of activin type IIB receptor. It's an inhibitor of myostatin and other naturally occurring proteins that limit muscle growth. Now, why does that happen in our body? Why do we have mechanisms in our body to halt muscle growth? And look, the bottom line is it's called survival. You don't just grow forever. If you just grew forever, you would end up 1,000 pounds of muscle, right? You would just keep gaining strength forever, but it doesn't work like that. So that kind of flies in the face to a lot of the bro science you hear out there. What happens is, look, I could be a power lifter my whole life. I'm not going to be as strong in my 70s as I was in my 30s. That just happens. You can't just keep improving over time. Now, these types of PEDs, in this case, the Ace-031, gives you the ability to kind of open that can of worms to where you do grow more and more. Now, this is kind of a double-edged sword because people who suffer from bigorexia, we've seen them dropping dead really, really young in their 30s and their 40s. I'm thinking of Rich Piana, for example, definitely a guy who had bigorexia and a guy who was obsessed with being big and couldn't accept losing even a half a pound because he would flip out. Oh my God, I lost a centimeter off my muscle. I'm freaking out. So for him, something like this would be right up his alley. But unfortunately, without these mechanisms in place to kind of give a check on the body, that you'll end up basically just dying. You can't just keep growing forever. So why would they come up with this compound? Genetically developed to bind myostatin before it can attach to its receptor to halt muscle growth. The two biopharma companies that worked on this compound were Shire and Aceleron. So as I talked about, the myostatin, it's a hormone in our bodies. It signals muscles to stop growing and replicating. So when you inhibit, you block myostatin, your muscles will be able to grow bigger and you'll become stronger. So this is why myostatin inhibitors are something that bodybuilders have dreamed of really throughout history. I mean, I'm sure you could go back to, world wars and generals wanting their guys to be bigger and stronger than their opponent in trench warfare. And then you come up into the 50s and 60s, guys wanted to get big, 70s, 80s. And then now we have access to stuff like this, which are out there. But it's going to cost you. It's not cheap. So anytime you see one of these compounds cheap out there, or if it's in the bottle or something, and it claims to be a myostatin inhibitor, we've seen these products like that on the forums, it's bullshit. Because something like this that does something like this, there's going to be a lot of demand and very little supply out there for the PED community. So it's not going to be something cheap at all. And we're going to get into the price later on. It'll kind of blow your mind how expensive this stuff is. So yeah, I'm going to bring in Mobster, and why don't you give your thoughts on it?
Right. So one of the things I said before, guys, is that you should look at the medical or clinical research. What was it being developed for? Why was it being created? Trust me, guys, it is not for athletes. It is not for bodybuilders. It's not for weightlifters. But of course, we like the idea, in principle, of this unleashed muscle growth. Right now, there's a couple of things. Firstly, the medical stuff. Muscular dystrophy is an obvious one, Steve, and muscle wasting conditions. And I'm thinking not just of muscle wasting conditions and diseases, but also, for example, if a patient has to be immobilized. And we know, I'll give you the classic example here, Steve, and I'm sure several of our listeners will have had this. You've had a broken leg, and they've had to put that baby in a cast. Now imagine you've broken your hips or your lower back, and the surgeons have done a fabulous job of putting you back together, but you are immobilized. You will shrink. And that's just kind of normal. But in a way, you want the muscles to stay a little bit bigger than the way that they might shrink down, just to support the bone growth and the support. When you finally manage to get out of bed, We don't want your arms so weak that you can't use crutches, and so on and so forth. So the idea that there's a drug out there that would inhibit muscular shrinkage by opening up, so to speak, the taps that allow for muscular growth while you're doing nothing is useful in a medical scenario. Go back to the nature thing that Steve talks about as a good example. We've talked about this another podcast way back at the beginning when Steve and I first started doing this stuff together. It was things like when you're out hunting with a spear and a bow and arrow and all that kind of stuff way back in the day. The idea that if you weigh 400 pounds of muscle, you're going to require an enormous amount of food and an enormous amount of energy. And quite simply, you're not going to be running with the pack of guys going hunting and chasing after antelope in the lake. It's just not how humans have survived. This, and so Steve talks about the blue zone people when he talked about the healthy and older healthy people that live around the world. These are never giants. They are never enormous 300, 400 pound people. It's always smaller. So arguably, nature doesn't want us to get too big. As a prime example, in nature, and I'm thinking here of the sperm whale, Steve, the calf requires 3 tons, just 3 tons of milk per day, and will put on, I think it's something ridiculous, like 100 kilograms a day from feeding with its mum. And its mum, for the 3 months that it's doing this stuff, it doesn't feed, I believe. It's just, that's the kind of stuff that you're looking at, guys. So the volume of food, and even other things like injuries, Steve, if you add uninhibited muscle to a normal frame, we've talked about this before, your frame, your connective tissue, the fascia, hasn't been affected by the myostatin inhibition. Your muscles have. So the potential for muscle tears, muscle strains, even bone strains, bone aches, is a lot higher. So again, on paper, in principle, we like the idea of uninhibited, unlimited muscle, but in reality, there are issues. And there's further issues that came with these studies, which Steve and I will get into. Back to you, Steve.
So let's get into more stuff about Ace-031 here. Look, all you need to do to get a dramatic increase in muscle mass is just a little decrease in myostatin. You know, it's there. It's keeping you from building muscle. It's keeping you from building strength. So you're also going to need more food to feed those muscles as well. So another problem is that our heart would continue growing since it's a muscle. Over time, this could lead to heart failure to have this organ work too hard. We've seen the autopsies of these bodybuilders who have been opened up, and yes, they're bigger guys, but their organs are much bigger than they should be. You know, double the size, 1.5 the size, double the, you know, or 3 times the size even. And we've seen them have a lot of things in their body. You know, we've seen like Dallas McCarver, he had cancer. They found cancer in him when they did the autopsy on him. So what is the long-term risk of running a myostatin inhibitor like this? You know, I mean, obviously, if you've got an unhealthy heart, it's going to inhibit your gains over time. If you got unhealthy organs, it's going to inhibit. So these are the risks that come with using these myostatin inhibitors. I just want to be clear. You know, I wonder too, a lot of this stomach distentation you see with these guys, you know, the plumboism look. I wonder if that has to do with myostatin as well. Just growing those organs and growing the gut so much, you know, that could definitely increase it. I think the main thing is too much food. These guys are eating very poor. They eat a lot of inflammatory foods, a lot of fast food, a lot of junk foods that they shouldn't be eating, and that causes it too. So, another thing, and we've seen this in studies of myostatin inhibitors, is you might have a muscle group or muscle grow more than another. So I can remember reading a study that they did with myostatin inhibitors on females, and in this study, overweight females were given a one-time dose of 250 milligrams of Ace-031. After a month, their muscles in the thighs grew over a pound. Their lean body mass increased 3%. And that's quite a change in their lean body mass. But the point is their thighs grew, you know, so it's not like you're going to take it and it's going to magically make the muscles you want to grow, and the muscles you don't want to grow not grow. So that's kind of a point. They did one more study, a mobster, on young boys with muscle dystrophy, and the test subject ended up having gum and nose bleeding. So Shire and Acceleron pharmaceutical companies, they eventually abandoned their partnership, and since 2013, no further developments have been conducted. But since just like everything else, a lot of these compounds, that's what happens. But then bodybuilders, obviously, they pick them up, and that's why Ace-031 has been sold as a research chemical since then. Yep. So Monster, jump in. Yeah.
So one of the things that Steve and I discussed in the pre-show is the element of how studies are done, and what some of our younger listeners might fail to recognize is what's called peer-reviewed research. So, for example, as Steve's already quoted, you've had a result where, I'd actually question, for example, the thigh growth, Steve, because I would say, was they only being allowed to do leg extensions or leg press? Because that's quite often done in studies where literally they just literally do 2 or 3 exercises, and those are the only muscles that are scanned or MRI'd or checked or whatever, or measured. And obviously, it's the actual specific use, as I mentioned earlier on, with regards to clinical use, muscular dystrophy being an example that I used. The young kids had gums and nose bleeding, like Steve's already said. And then you've got other research chemicals that are out there, where, for example, Steve, a myo-029, no results whatsoever. None, the trial failed miserably, and the subjects had 0 strength gains. In another one, which we mentioned in the article, Ace-031, and there's an image of a mouse, and it's had its skin removed, etc., ready for dissection, and they appear to have site injected one of the legs, and because only one of the legs is enhanced, the other leg's not. So you go, okay, that would be great, because as Steve said, if you have general unlimited muscle growth, you have issues with different muscles getting out of proportion, which would be, again, no good to a bodybuilder. Huge arms, silly shoulders, or whatever else. And especially, as we said, as Steve said earlier on, with muscular, where the perception of what you look like is skewed. And we see this with the guys that have injected stunt enhancement oils. The same issue would apply here. People would just be injecting their arms. So they'd end up with 40-inch biceps and triceps, but almost no chest and very weak shoulders, which could barely be able to lift their arms up. It needs to be kind of balanced, and it's not balanced. And none of the studies that we're looking at here, and none of the items that have been looked at, have come across really, really well. One, for example, Steve, and I'm talking about side effects again, in a study with females, the concentration of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, dropped significantly. What does that mean? It means that their hair growth slowed down. And guys don't like hair growth slowing down. Women like it even less. It's the baldness, alopecia is quite, it's not sex specific. It happens all the time. But trust me, the majority of users and listeners to this podcast and on the forums are men. And the amount of men that worry about hair loss is enormous. Steve knows this because he's seen the same forum questions and threads that I have. So guys, would you want to have huge arms, site enhanced, because you've used some sort of myostatin inhibitor that actually works site specific, but lose your hair or slowly lose your hair? So again, every single study we've looked at, even for different versions of this, has had either some issue, just for example, which we'll get into briefly, the cost, or side effects, or no specific result, and so on and so forth. So I have a question right now, Steve. I don't mind that companies make products available because there's a demand for them, but arguably, the magic elixir, guys, isn't out there yet. There isn't a specific one that we're going to go, right, this works, and you get muscular growth all over, the heart state's in great condition, you keep your hair, there are no nosebleeds, there's no gum bleeding, and it works for men as well for women. There's nothing exists like that yet. So, I mean, we do this podcast as per usual to give you as much information as possible, to answer questions that we know are being asked. That's another reason why we do this podcast. And we look at these things before we come on. And Steve, right now, that little magic pill, that magic injection that we want doesn't exist. And it doesn't even exist for the medical conditions that these products were being looked at as being developed for. When a pharmaceutical company abandons a research project, you could potentially be talking hundreds of millions of dollars. Certainly, I would say anywhere between 30 and $50 million, Steve, as an investment just for this. Now, that's not so bad for a huge pharmaceutical company, but by the time it gets to market, it could easily be on the order, especially with the FDA and other governmental requirements, not just in the US, but across the world, on the order of $1 billion, $1,000 million to bring a product like this to market for muscular dystrophy, never mind for athletic use. And they've abandoned the projects, or they've failed, or it hasn't worked, or the side effects haven't been worth it. So keep that in mind, guys. That's the way the pharmaceutical companies, like if they developed a super steroid, we'd be all over it. But it would still cost them $1 billion to bring it to market. But we'd know about it, we'd want it, we'd be using it. This would be the one that we're all looking for, and it hasn't happened in the way that it needs to. And again, the rules for this stuff is you need multiple studies by different groups of people to allow peer-reviewed research, prove that the technology, the chemical, the actual physical use at the dosing that's suggested in the original study works as suggested. And that hasn't happened yet. Back to you, Steve.
All right, so let's get into the fun stuff, how to dose it. So look, at the bottom line is, look, you know, some of you out there may want to use this. Some of you out there are, you know, you have bigorexia. You want to get big. You want to try it out. You want to see what it can do for you. You want to get big quick. You want to get strong quick. This might be an option for you, you know, but most of you, and we've talked about some of these compounds too in prior podcasts, most of you, this is just simply out of your league. And we're going to get into the cost of this, and it's going to show you that it's going to knock most of you out of the league too. Here's the thing. There's been studies done on this, and the subjects experience a reduction in leptin concentration and boosted good fat hormone. So there is some argument that Ace-031 also can help with fat loss. So this is something that a lot of guys would love. I mean, who doesn't want to lose fat and gain a shit ton of muscle and a shit ton of strength quickly? Who? You know, so another study showed alkaline phosphatase in the blood and reduced collagen telopeptide. So that shows that it helps strengthen the bones. So you weight train and your bones already get strong. So this is interesting that the bones had an effect. All right, so the fun part we're going to talk about is the dosage and the cost. So rat studies, these are the real thing. They were given 10 milligrams per kilogram. So to match those types of numbers, a normal size adult bodybuilder would have to use about 1 gram a month, all things being equal. So this means that if you were to use 1 gram, it would cost you a lot of money. So dosing from bodybuilders, 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight every 1 to 2 weeks. So I've seen, Mobster and I were talking about this on the pre-show, I've seen 1 milligram selling for about $175. I've seen other places selling 5 milligrams for about $150. So let's kind of do the math on that, Mobster. So go through the math. Yeah, go ahead.
2 seconds.
Yep.
Yeah, so I run the maths for Steve in the pre-show, and we come up with a figure of $12,000 a month, and that's at the best and most reasonable price that we could. And we talked about the potential for an obsessive person coming into the sport. Let's say they weigh, I think the average for the UK is somewhere around 154 pounds, and they desire to become a Mr. Olympia. So we go, okay, if they gained 1 pound of muscle in the way that the very early study that we mentioned did, arguably maybe 2 pounds of muscle a month, but it was continuous while they use this product. Of course, they would gain some muscle from training anyway, as you know, Steve. you'd arguably be looking at a cost of somewhere between, and this is how it gets crazy, 120,000 to $250,000 just on this one peptide, not on anything else you're doing, not on your training, not on your clothing, not on, certainly not on your nutrition, and all the other things that are required in order to become a, hopefully, and again, it still would be hopefully, competitive bodybuilder at the Olympia level, because you don't know how your physique's going to turn out. That no one does, not the Olympia level guys, no one. And so one assumes they've spent $250,000 in order to look something like a top 10 Olympia competitor. I said in the pre-show to Steve, right, there are, outside of Arnold, who made more money outside of bodybuilding in films and in property than he did within the sport, only 3 bodybuilders that I would argue that have made any serious money from the sport itself, and then again only towards the end or height of their careers, and that would be Phil Heath, Ronnie Coleman, and Jay Cutler. Jay Cutler more than probably the other two, because he had a great deal of sponsors, and I believe he's still doing something on the order of about $2 million, $3 million a year right now. So the cost of versus return on the likelihood that you might arguably look like a top 10 Olympia competitor is, I don't know that it adds up, Steve. And again, it's this disposable income thing. We did a podcast the other day where the numbers were even worse. It was more than that per day for that particular peptide. Look at a list of peptides for that particular one. It's just out there, Steve, in terms of the money. There's a suggestion, for example, top 10 Olympia competitors, or even the top 20, top 30, spending on the order of $30,000 to $50,000 to get ready for a competition, whether that's loss of income, peptides, growth hormone, anabolic steroids, and any other drug that they might do. And again, you get to the top 10, only the top 3 are getting anywhere close to that kind of money. You're only looking at somewhere between $10,000 and $30,000 for the other top competitions outside of the Arnold Olympia. So again, the maths don't add up. And again, the sponsorship, the return, you need to have a Coca-Cola or a Nike with you. And again, we're not really seeing that in the sport as yet. So it's, again, cost versus return, incredibly expensive. That's just on the money. Potential for risk is still quite high, and minimal studies that have worked. So for me, ultimately, I would say, even if I had muscle dysmorphia, even if my desire was to get to 400 pounds, I'd have to say a no. The only thing, the one plus was probably the simple fact that you only need to inject every 2 weeks, Steve, which is fabulous. And relatively speaking, it's quite a small amount, 100 to 300 milligrams every 2 weeks. So in terms of actual liquid powder, whatever you want to call it, going in, it's minimal, and the amount of times that you need a jab is minimal. Here's the thing, guys, you can gain, some of you will gain on your first steroid cycle 10 pounds. Some of you might even gain more, and that's going to cost you $500 or $600, especially if you buy stuff during a sale, versus this, where you're talking about, if it's £2 a month, Steve, you're talking about $6,000 per pound of muscle gain. So yeah, it's the kind of maths, etc., etc., etc. For me, it would be a no just on the economics. Half-life of this, guys, is quite long, and it needs to be, again, that's the reason why you're only jabbing it twice a month, 10 to 15 days. I mean, look at this, Steve. If we look at all these kind of things and we go back and forth over it, you and I have gone back and forth over it on the forums and some of these podcasts, and we understand that you guys are looking for a kind of dream product, a dream drug that works in its particular way. But as I said earlier on, doesn't need to be site specific. So you works great if you've got a fantastic physique, but your calves are really poor. That would be good. Or is it generalized? And if it's generalized, you would need to be on top of your training to make sure that nothing got too carried away. Would it work? For example, we talked about this before, and I said people that are in bed inactive due to some medical condition, what's it going to do to you going to the gym where you're physically trying to train? Do you need to train if your muscles are just getting bigger because you've had this injection? Again, I'd want to look at that first study, Steve, and see, for example, as happens a lot in these kind of studies where they're only doing leg press or bench press or one, even just grip, which would be my thing. They literally just train 1 or 2 things and they use that as a control mechanism so that at the end of the cycle, they say, oh, the study, 12, 16 weeks, their quad strength went up by 25%, their thigh size went up by 2 inches, and so on and so forth. Their body fat went down. All of these kind of things. And again, what about, for example, the fact that you mentioned earlier on, Steve? Not only was the potential for gaining muscle there, but the potential for losing fat was there. Would that mean, for example, if you continue to take it, you'd get leaner and leaner and leaner? Being super lean is amazing to look at and great for competitions. We know that. But long term, being super lean is unhealthy. There's a risk there for you to catch certain immune problems with like colds and flus and being stiff. And again, unlimited muscular growth, like Steve said, I've been fortunate, and I know some of our listeners will be, like we talked about just now, to gain a certain amount of muscle, and some cycles more than others, perfectly normal. There's the diminishing returns. The more cycles you do, you won't keep gaining 15 or 20 pounds. That'd be ridiculous, like Steve said. But if you could guarantee by use of this product to gain, for argument's sake, £2 a month, year on year, assuming you could afford it, would your body keep up? Would your body compensate? Would your organs adjust? Would, as Steve said, for example, your stomach grow? Would you have problems with not being able to literally feed the mechanism that you've created? Just sheer volume of food that would be required would increase. It'd increase as you grew. It doesn't stay the same. And so muscles don't grow without fuel. It's just, there's a bunch of stuff out there, Steve. And like I said, would we end up with a situation where people don't go to the gym? That might be useful for medical situations, but I don't know necessarily that it'd be useful for this, especially if the rest of the body, like I said earlier on, with the connective tissue wasn't adapted. Back to you, Steve.
Yeah, so I mean, final thoughts on this look. I mean, it's one of the things where give it a shot if you really want to see what this stuff is all about and you got the money, try it out. See if you like it. Try it out for a couple weeks. Try it out for a month. If you want to, if you don't mind spending that kind of cash, see what it does. Yeah. If you're stuck at a plateau, maybe it's something, you've been stuck at the same plateau and you're getting really frustrated. Maybe it's something that's right up your alley, but I wouldn't abuse it. I wouldn't abuse it for a long period of time. Not just for the financial cost, but also for the risks of the side effects. So I wouldn't use it past then. But look, at the end of the day, a lot of these guys, these top end guys, I was talking to Mobster about this, they might be sponsored by some of these companies. And the company is going to be like, look, I'll throw you a couple vials of Ace. Will you post about it on your social media? And then boom, they post about it and then they give a good review on it and people go and they buy a bunch of it. So I could definitely see some of the top end bodybuilders who are really, really trying to win and try to get as big as possible. I can see them being able to afford to use it because of that, so, or, discounts. Hey, let's give you a discount code. I'll give you 50% off discount code. Here's the code. And then they go and buy it that way. So there's definitely some ways to do it. Who knows? You could come on our forums if you want and say, hey, I'll log this, and can I get a bottle of this stuff? And I'll log it for a month. And I'll do a daily update. Maybe one of our sponsors will be like, hey, I'll hook you up with a couple bottles here. You can do it. You can do it. So there's different ways around the financial aspect, but at the end of the day, just know what you're putting in your body and know what the stuff is all about. So it's definitely not something that would be something I would want to try, but it's something that a lot of you out there who do have, bigorexia issues, and there's nothing wrong with admitting it. You walk into the gym and we see these guys. They, it's funny. They have big trucks, Mobster. The truck wheels are like really, really high.
Yeah.
And then they're inside and they're big. They got tats. They're just they're wearing a tank top and they're huge.
Oh, yeah.
It's all about big. They want to be big. I don't know. Are they trying to compensate for something? I have no idea. But some people are like that. Some people want big. Some people want sporty. They want a sports car. They want a fast sports car. Even though you push the gas and you're going to get a speeding ticket. So everybody's different. I'm not here to judge anyone. We're all different.
Mm-hmm.
We all have different insecurities. We all have different goals. So if you want to use this stuff, then give it a shot. Just make sure you buy from a legitimate place, because a lot of these peptide companies are sketchy. There's no regulations. You could buy you could be buying something that's not even what they're selling. You could be buying something that's completely different. They could sell you GHRP instead of the ACE. You don't know. And then you get some results. You're like, yeah, this stuff works. So make sure you go a legitimate company when you use that. That's all I ask. So, Mobster, finish your final thoughts and take us a disclaimer. I thought it was a really good show. I thought the guys really learned a lot about ACE in this one.
No, I say this as someone who's well over 300 pounds, as Steve knows. There's an argument to be made for exactly what Steve said earlier on, in terms of some people's inherent desire to just be the absolute biggest they possibly can be. And I understand it, but it's perverse, Steve. You and I got more muscular and stronger. We didn't kind of get hung up on it in the way that you would have expected us to have done. Literally, as we got bigger, the need to get bigger wasn't as crazy as it was when we started. And whether that's just the body compensating, or whether that's adjusting to the fact that we're bigger, I moan about coats not fitting and having to adjust my belt size for my weightlifting belt and all that kind of stuff, and then moaning about not being able to put enough weights on the machine and all that kind of stuff. So it gets kind of weird in that you start off with this kind of process and you end up in a different direction or feeling differently about it, while still being, in my case, over 300 pounds. So there's swings and roundabouts to that, Steve. You know what? In my mind, the best use of this, and again, I would want to be careful with the guys that went crazy with the site enhancement, the best use of any of these similar peptides, and I'm thinking specifically of Ace-031, but a couple of the others would be site enhancement of a poor muscle group. And again, the classic example would be you've got an absolutely amazing physique, you're ripped to shreds, etc., but your calf insertions are real high, to the point, and I'm thinking of Ronnie Comedy here, 300 pounds on stage, ripped, 23-inch arms, huge chest, massive back, great big Zeppelin like quads, and yet, although he had large muscular calves compared to the normal guy, they weren't extreme as much as the rest of his physique was. So something like this that might have a site-specific enhancement potential, used sensibly to balance the physique out. And again, I'd want someone coaching me to keep an eye on, not let me get 40-inch calves or something stupid. That's where I can see the potential for this going. In terms of the actual finance, etc., and the potential risk for side effects, and simply the fact that some studies showed next to no results for very similar products, or as we said, nosebleeds and gum bleeding and so on and so forth, it's just not enough evidence of any of the things that we truly want from a product like this for me to want to go that particular direction. And of course, I'm a cheap ass. I'm not going to spend $6,000 or $12,000 a month. I barely spent that kind of money putting my gym together, Steve. I'm not sure that I'd want to spend it on a peptide. But again, we do this podcast to give you the information for those of you that are willing to take the risk, and for those of you that have the disposable income. You might have a trust fund. Not everybody on this podcast is poor. Some of you are well off. And in fact, Steve talked about this previously, the typical PED user has sufficient disposable income. They're not out robbing people or mugging people for the money. So again, you're spending $500 to $1,000 a month. You can save your money up. You can give this a spin. And the information is out there for you. Please note, we are not doctors, and the opinions are ours. It is our view and based on experience and views on the topic. Our podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.